Hi, and welcome to EnviroCentre's Green Room. Meet the people on the front lines of climate action and find out what keeps them up at night. I'm Mandy, and this week we're joined by Sundeep Virdi, Chair of the EnviroCentre Board of Directors. Welcome, Sundeep.
Thanks, Mandy. Thanks for inviting me. I'd like to take a moment to start by acknowledging that I'm calling from Ottawa on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation.
Thank you for that. Much appreciated. And a great reminder to kind of, remember where we stand. Would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yes, I'm Sundeep Virdi, and I've been a member on the board of directors of EnviroCentre since 2016.
Great. Thank you for joining us. So we ask all of our guests to bring one environmental fact to share. What have you brought with you today?
Yeah, it was hard to choose just one, as I'm sure many of your other guests have had this challenge. But the fact I'd like to bring forward is an insight from Mark Jacquard's book, The Citizen's Guide to Climate Success. In it, Jacquard states that although people are generally open to scientific findings, they're less likely to change when the findings conflict with their financial interests or lifestyle. So, given that addressing climate change demands that we divest from fossil fuels and give up a lot of our lifestyle conveniences, I personally was really dissuaded by the recent IPCC report to affect change, because when I reviewed it, I thought, how long has it been since we've heard this same scientific fact? And, when is it going to be time that we accept that it's not enough to motivate changing people's behaviors or beliefs? I kind of got into learning about climate change since I was 10 years old, a long time ago. And since then, been an advocate, trying to communicate in different ways how best to resonate with people on that level where they might be inspired to take action. In the beginning, it was even just trying to convince people that climate change was a real phenomenon. So this problem of how to communicate the challenges has been with me for a very long time, for over 2 decades. And I recall attending a workshop by a UK psychologist whose name, unfortunately, I don't remember, but he was studying this phenomenon. And he found that climate skeptics are more moved to change their minds when the climate crisis is framed as a moral dilemma than a rational one. At the time, I was working in the nonprofit sector when this workshop, I participated in this workshop, but it was really peculiar to me to hear this from a psychologist's perspective, because it made me want to investigate further. If the evidence is not enough, what is? And if it is a moral kind of rationale, what does that mean? So I ended up taking a class in morality to try to understand how this works. So what I learned was that, especially in the Western world, most of our moral theory, if not all of it, is based on the rational choice theory of individualism, which dictates that we always or almost always act in our self-interest. Put it simply, there are essentially 2 types of groups. There are those who maximize or seek to maximize their own utility by always acting in their self-interest, even if it jeopardizes their long-term prospects and disadvantages their social relationships. And then there are those who seek to optimize their utility, and they're willing to take a little less of the pie and contribute a little bit more to ensure that others can walk away beneficial from an agreement as well. So, this is a cornerstone in so much of our society, especially in our legal and economic systems. But I always found a major flaw in this theory is that it's predicated on the myth of the individual, whereas human beings are social and community-oriented, and are also driven by altruistic and caregiving tendencies that can't be explained exclusively by utility-driven models of behavior. However, while our moral choices may not be entirely explainable by utility-seeking behavior, our economic choices rarely diverge from this framework. And while the two may be interchangeable, they're not collapsible. And I think that from an economic perspective, cost considerations require individuals to make trade-offs on values. So, for example, we can be convinced to pay a higher price for a vehicle because we can't factor in comfort, style, and status in our purchasing decisions, but yet we resist fare increases for transit because we believe that so-called free riders exploit the system. I put a lot of thought into this, and I think that treating the commons as a collective responsibility is what we need to move forward. So, for example, seeing our fares as a contribution to the social good rather than payment for an individualized service means moving to a system where we balance cost efficiencies with effective social and economic policy.
Thank you for that very well thought out answer. That was really interesting, kind of a really interesting take on what you learned from the psychologist. Thank you. So, I mean, perhaps it's related to what you just said, perhaps it's different, but what climate problem keeps you up at night?
Political inertia. So in thinking about, how we can make change, I ended up going back to law school to reflect on how our moral drivers can influence our laws and policies, for better or for worse. Like, we like to think that our governments are inclined to rely on evidence-based decision-making, but 3 decades of forestalling in the face of 6 IPCC reports demonstrate that this is not the case. Since Canada signed the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, we've witnessed governments setting climate targets that are not met, compromising climate gains by expanding fossil fuel activities, and abdicating international climate agreements. This is worsened by the legal patchwork governing Canadian environmental law, and it's weakened by political assaults to environmental legislation, which creates a governance vacuum that invites economic exploitation and threatens our ecosystems. Yet I still think that the climate crisis has played out as a cultural crisis, because our political systems are really ill-structured to adapt to the complexity of climate decision-making. Yet we know the solutions can be quite simple, and we've had some success. One of the most impactful climate action occurred when Ontario phased out coal-fired power plants in 2014, and that represented 25% of its electricity generation at the time. But the decision resulted in cleaner air, decreased asthma attacks, and a 17% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. We know that cutting emissions at the source is the most effective way to mitigate climate change. Yet it seems that a great deal of the focus is given to questionable technological solutions, and too little attention is given to common sense solutions. For example, autonomous vehicles are proposed as a solution to road safety, but they require significant investment, complete infrastructure overhaul, and are accompanied by a substantial greenhouse gas footprint. A simpler solution to road safety would be to introduce breathalyzers to initiate ignition start and speed inhibitors to limit the maximum travel speed to 100 kilometers an hour. Do we really need cars that can reach 260 kilometers an hour? I believe we need to be critical about how climate solutions are framed and to hold governments accountable by fully examining the technological assumptions embedded in their proposals through a legal, social, ecological, and economic lens, and to examine how the beneficiaries and inequities of the plans are distributed. Ultimately, we're asking people to make huge changes in their lives, and we need to earn their trust through our businesses, through our community, and through our institutional and political organizations.
That is a big problem to keep you up at night. Very understandable that would be on your mind. So I mean, I think you've mentioned a couple of the solutions in your answer there, but just to kind of continue on that, what is the solution?
For me, the solution is to take a systems approach to thinking about the climate problem. And I read this paper once by Thomas Homer Dixon. It's his 2010 Mannion lecture on complexity science and public policy. And it's still one of the best readings I've encountered to date. And I'm constantly sharing this with other people. Because it helps us understand how complex systems are at the center of good policy making. At the center of good policy making, I should say. In my experience, I worked at 3 different municipal governments, and anytime you talk to anyone who works in government, they always talk about how siloed it is. For me, I think that the key to overcoming the siloed approach to decision making is to adopt the transformational theory of change management. So I'll give you an example. So in one role, I had created this like cross-departmental team, and I needed senior managers in different departments to participate in joint decision making. And there were a couple of individuals who were, really not supportive of what I was doing, and I became frustrated. And so I reached out to my director, and she was like a huge proponent of transformational change. And she said, Sundeep, if you want to communicate effectively with your audience, you need to deliver your message 7 times in 7 different ways before it lands with them. And I really found that liberating, and I still think about that today because it revealed to me that rather than seeing the problem as a deadlock between me and this person and this project, I saw it as like a creative roadblock that I could overcome to be a more effective leader. I joined EnviroCentre's board also because I really believe in community building and grassroots activism. I truly think that's the antidote to political inertia and apathy because it's founded on citizen inclusion and democratic decision making. I really enjoy my volunteering with EnviroCentre because I see it as one way to contribute to cultural transformation. When I started, I was one of 2 women on the board, and I've worked to increase the diversity of perspectives at the board level. That took some time, and now we're at the point where we have gender parity, and we also have the incredible leadership of our first female executive director, Sharon Coward. So, I'd like to think that the small changes that you bring to the table can help to steer conversations to foster collaborative decision making that's based on respect, openness, and inclusivity. So for me, the solution is really participating in organizations with an aim to transform their culture. I think that's the key to unlocking our climate transition. And it really doesn't require big gestures. We're immersed in politics and policies, and it plays out in the way we communicate and the way we make decisions. It's really about relationship building, and I truly believe that winning hearts is the key to changing minds, and that achieving both requires building trust.
Okay, so next question is, what's in the way?
So the biggest challenge in transformational change theory and in the climate crisis is how do you build consensus out of disagreement? That's the real challenge to transforming organizational culture and also to transforming our social and economic systems. The reality is that we're never going to achieve 100% consensus, and we don't have very good models for anti-hierarchical systems. But I truly think that we can look for alternative models in different cultures, and we can try and carefully experiment within our own organizations to discover new ways of affecting change. So, as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't really require big gestures, but it does require kind of stepping outside of your comfort zone and looking beyond just the barriers that are in the way. It requires conceiving a vision for your organization. It could even be as small as conceiving a vision for your family and, or your neighborhood, and taking that and looking for ways to make it more inclusive and make it more democratic. And I think that means listening to more voices.
I really like that. I think those are all just really great reminders about how we can all work together to achieve something that will ultimately benefit all of us. So how can people help?
So my little catchphrase for this is big or small, get involved. Transforming our political and cultural landscape involves empowering a citizen-centered democracy that inspires people into action. So if you've had the opportunity to meet with any EnviroCentre staff member, you've likely been completely captivated by their warmth and optimism. And it's really invigorating to have that in your life, and it gives you a sense of belonging. With climate change, we're really in it together, and we have to find a way to work together across personal, political, and professional lines. So whether it's by attending a climate strike, volunteering in your community, writing your political representatives, or dedicating your skills to climate action, you're contributing to culture change. And this happens through dialogue. And for me, EnviroCentre is really changing the conversation.
We are changing the conversation. I agree. So with all of that in mind, all of these amazing concepts and thoughts and ideas that you've brought forward, what is the good future?
So the good future is that every being belongs. I truly believe that understanding our own patterns of behavior and decision-making are the key to unlocking change to live more loving and ecologically minded lives. When our consciousness activates this insight, the interconnection of all living beings becomes more visible because we pay attention to how this struggle plays out all around us. So I'd like to share a personal story. While we were in lockdown during COVID, I started taking these very long meditative walks. And one afternoon, a large crow flew down a few feet away from me. I looked at it and it turned its gaze directly at me. And it was a really strange encounter because I felt it could see me and I could see it. And we were both bewildered with each other. But at the same time, I was struck by my reaction towards it because I doubly realized that there was this uncanniness I felt, the sense of this crow invading my personal space. But then on the other hand, questioning why I felt that it didn't belong there to begin with. I've been thinking about that encounter a lot. And I think that when we hear of climate stats, like, the forest fires and the sea levels rising, we have this fear that our homes will be destroyed, that our resources will be depleted, that our seasons will be disrupted. But the world doesn't only belong to us. And I'm slipping in another fact here, so I'm breaking the rules. Sorry, Mandy. But we're in the middle of the sixth extinction. And in the 1970s, when they first started tracking the rate of extinction, the species rate of extinction, 2 to 3 species were going extinct every year. And today that rate is 2 to 3 species are going extinct every day. That is really a fact that evokes a genuine sense of sadness within me. And it goes back to the crow because it makes me think that and question why we've created a world where that allows us to presume a right to live and own and occupy the earth as its exclusive subject. And why is it that we're so incapable of sharing the world with other living beings? Sorry, I'm not putting this out there as an answer, but I'm also not putting it out there as a question. I'm suggesting that this is an invitation for us to discover our own place on the earth and to enlarge that sphere, to include more living beings, to include more trees and plants and insects and fish and mammals and reptiles and birds, as well as more people, because I think that every being belongs here.
That's it for this week's Green Room. Thanks so much for joining us as we get to the heart of climate action. You can find out more about our work and sign up for our newsletter at EnviroCentre.ca. Follow us on your favorite podcast app or subscribe on YouTube. See you next time.